Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Ashley Faris and I teach at Mission College. And today I wanted to talk about how our brain works. I'm actually pretty new to studying brain-based research and teaching techniques. And I felt very inspired by the book written by Zaretta Hammond called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And so in the book, she goes over our brain's hardwire, our nervous system, and how all of that impacts how we learn. So I wanted to share that with you all today. So whether you're an educator or you're a student, I hope that you find this information valuable. And feel free to contact me if you want these slides or want to share this recording with someone else. Please share the wealth of information. And just full disclosure, I have my background in chemistry and not in neuroscience. I'm just really fascinated by this research and how it impacts education. So if you're in my class, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, I thought I was taking a chemistry class and not a neuroscience class. Well, oftentimes when I have students come to my class, I hear them say, I studied so many hours on this chapter and it's still not making any sense. When I was listening to your lecture, my brain kept wandering. I just couldn't focus. I am so scared of chemistry. I have heard horror stories about this class. And I've had a bad experience in my previous chemistry class. Now, since 2011, when students would come to me with these questions or statements about how they were doing in my class or their fears and anxieties about my course, more often than not, I wanted to give them a solution to fix all those fears and anxieties. And usually the solution involved something that worked for me. And what I'm realizing is that's not a solution for everyone. And for me to help guide students to feel safe and to be able to learn the content in my class, I need to be able to better understand how their brain works. So, what is our brain's primary purpose? Well, it wants to avoid any threats to our safety at all costs. So let's look into the hardware. I find that if I can name it and understand what's going on, then it just makes so much more sense why I might be behaving a certain way. So if we look at the cross-section of the brain, and you can see the labels, you have the limbic region, the thalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the reticular activating system. We'll start with the reptilian region, what we call the lizard brain, and it houses the reticular activating system, also known as the RAS. What's the purpose of that? Well, it's reactive and it's responsible for alertness and attention. It's crucial to activate the RAS if we want to learn something new. The limbic region is also known as the emotional brain. The thalamus, which is housed in the limbic region, is all the information is allowed to pass through the RAS, except for smell, comes to the thalamus before it's directed to other parts of the brain. The hippocampus is also part of the limbic region. It's the brain's memory data bank. It's crucial to get working memory to interact with old knowledge in order for the learner to find relevance and store that information in long-term memory. So we have to remember that key there. If you're an educator out there, how can we get students to store the information we're teaching them to long-term memory? We have to connect to old memory. And the amygdala. The amygdala is the brain's guard dog, and it sends distress signals to the RAS. And so we'll talk a little bit about the hormones. So cortisol, if you've heard that, oh, I'm really stressed out, then you hear about the stress hormone cortisol. You're, Your body's just flushed with it during those episodes. And so that's what the amygdala is doing. It's sending out stress responses like cortisol or adrenaline during crisis times. And what's really important to recognize here and understand is that if the amygdala is activated, then all learning ceases. So if you're so stressed out or if something's personally happening to you, and then you go somewhere where you're trying to participate in a meeting or learn something new in class, you're not going to be able to focus, right? And that's because your amygdala is like sending all these stress signals throughout your body. There's also the neocortex region, which is the front of the brain. And so that's home to our executive function, which is the command center that oversees our thinking and manages our working memory. It controls planning, abstract thinking, organization and self-regulation, and imagination. What's really fascinating about this region is that it can learn and rewire itself. And that's what we call neuroplasticity, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And what also is very fascinating is that we have the ability to build our brain power in this region of the brain. But it is critical we can get past the two emotional gatekeepers, the reticular activating system, RAS, and the amygdala. And that's why it's important as educators and even as students to understand how our brains work. And this all comes from the idea of social emotional learning. And I'm not talking about that in this particular presentation, but that is the big theory here, that in order for us to engage with our students and help them learn, like they have to feel emotionally safe in their environment and in their classrooms. So I like to get down to the cellular structure here. The cellular structures are made of special nerves called neurons. And what are neurons? So they're messengers that carry information back and forth across each region of the brain that we just talked about. This stuff we call gray matter. And what's so neat here is that there's no fixed amount of gray matter in the brain. You're not just born with a little bit of gray matter and that's what you have for the rest of life. You can actually build it. The brain is able to grow an unlimited amount of gray matter in response to continuous learning. This is called neuroplasticity. The more wrinkles in your brain, the better, because these wrinkles represent a person's capacity to do complex thinking and problem solving. And I actually was just listening to a podcast recently on this idea of neuroplasticity. And this author and scientist really like to call it live wiring. But basically, he studies Alzheimer's disease and discusses ways in which patients who have early diagnosis of this disease can do exercises, like mental exercises that involve complex thinking and problem solving to help delay the symptoms and onset of Alzheimer's, which is really fascinating. So this work is not just applicable in education and when you're learning at the college level or even at the K through 12 level. It is a lifelong journey for all of us. So, definitely he had suggested, like, it's not just do Sudoku all the time. It's like if you master something, then try something new, like learn a new language or try a new game to play. So I just found that really fascinating. So let's look even deeper. So this is a picture of a neuron with axon and dendrites. So how do the neurons pass on information? Well, they do that through electrical impulses that travel along the long axon, which is an extension of the neuron until it connects with another neuron. And I like to think of this when I used to run track. And when I say track, I mean this was like middle school. But I remember doing races where we would have to pass the baton. I just loved it so much, being part of a team. And I remember I had to run so fast to get to the next person so that she would hopefully win the race. So you can think of neurons acting in that way in terms of passing on information through electrical impulses. Now, this information is exchanged through dendrites, and you can see that these are like the short finger-like extensions off of the neuron. And the more dendrites that we have, the more information the neurons can pick up and pass along. The brain signals the neurons to grow more dendrites in response to new cognitive challenges, novel problem solving, and increased physical activity. All right, so this whole idea is that we are in control of how much our brain can grow, right? It's just infinite. And so it's important as educators to always have new cognitive challenges and activities for our students to engage in, for help develop novel problem solving skills. And even, like when you're learning, get up and move around. I remember my favorite part of chemistry class was being in the laboratory. And I wonder how much of that had to do with me moving around and using my hands and pouring the chemicals and seeing the color changes, like all those things that help to engage my brain on a deeper level. So as I was reading this book, like I said, I'm not a neuroscientist and I haven't taken any neuroscience classes, but I learned about myelination. I wanted to share this with you because I thought it was also fascinating. So more than just, growing dendrites and whatnot. This is when the brain is learning. So when the brain is learning something new, it clusters neurons together to create what's called a neural pathway. You may have heard about neural pathways before. So you can just imagine a neural pathway is a cluster of neurons, right? And remember, those neurons are passing information between the different regions of the brain. And just to refresh, we have to get past the RAS and the amygdala before we even get to the neocortex, part of the brain where active learning can take place and memory. So anyways, just wanted to review real quick there. So remember, if we create neural pathways, we have deeper learning and we also engage our long-term memory. So the brain helps these neurons talk to each other faster along these neural pathways through the process of myelination. And so what that is that it wraps the body of the neurons with layers of fatty substance called myelin. And you're like, okay, so why do I care about this fatty substance? Well, that fat allows the brain to do more complex work because the fat allows the chemical and those electrical impulses to travel across the neuron faster. Right? I know there's been times when I'm at like meetings or in class and the professor asks a question and I'm like, I can't think fast enough. Like I kind of recognize what they're talking about. But yeah, the impulses aren't firing as quickly. Well, maybe I need to engage in more complex, deeper thinking and learning activities to help build that myelin. Also, I know I keep talking about the good news that we can grow our brains, ability for deep learning and long-term memory. Conversely, when we don't practice or use those new dendrites, let's say you do utilize a new skill, like let's say you are riding a bike for the first time, right? And, for all of us who've ridden our bikes and learned how to ride bikes for the first time, if we just did that one day when we were little, we would grow some new dendrites shortly after that learning episode. But our brain prunes those dendrites by starving them and then reabsorbing them if you don't revisit that activity again. And so that's something to also be aware of. If you're learning something new, and you just, like, let's say, for example, you're sitting in class and you're learning something, and then you take the quiz, and then you never look at that information again, right? Your brain's going to prune that information, those little dendrites that were starting to build little neural pathways, if you're not using it. So like the saying always goes, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. So it's important. So I know a technique that my students like to do is, I forgot the time periods between learning stuff, but basically they'll learn the material and then the next day they will review over it, practice with it, engage in conversation. And then 3 days later, they'll look at it again. And then 5 days later, they'll look at it again. And so kind of extending that time that they visit that material or interact with it in a creative way really helps to engage their memory and hopefully convert that short-term memory into long-term memory by that kind of repetition of revisiting that material. All right. So I know this sounds so scientific, right? And very just like a lot of hardwire, and the brain is so complicated and just a complex system, but it's more than that, right? I've alluded to the fact that there's the emotional part of our brain, and I want to discuss a bit of the nervous system. So it's important to note that the brain is a social organ. It works best when it has the opportunity to connect and interact with others. The nervous system is constantly picking up information from our environment and sending it back to the brain for interpretation and action. Remember, what was our brain's primary purpose? Right, it's to make sure that it keeps us safe. Right? To just not let any threats get near us, right? So even if you think you are sitting somewhere comfortable and safe, your brain is always aware of what's going on around you. Another thing to also kind of be reflecting on as I'm presenting while we're still in the middle of the pandemic, and majority of us are online learning. And so your environment may not be the classroom as we speak. It may be your home or somewhere else. And so be thinking about what kind of environment you're spending the most time engaging and learning. Now, in social settings, this ongoing process of trying to sniff out danger has been called neuroception. So when your body is just always kind of aware, even if you're not cognizant of that awareness, that's called neuroception. It's always looking out for danger. And this is also referred to as the unconscious safety threat detection system. And our nervous system is composed of 3 different nervous systems or categories, 2 of which you're probably familiar with: the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is focused on keeping us relaxed. It seeks our well-being by satisfying our needs for food, for shelter, for social relationships, and sex. Now, if you ever hear the hormones or the chemical transmitters dopamine and serotonin that make you feel happy, this is all thanks to our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system, this one is focusing on keeping us alert and ready to react so that we can avoid danger by fight, flight, or freeze. Now, when our body engages in with the sympathetic nervous system, it's going to release some adrenaline. And so if you're getting ready for a big presentation, you might feel the adrenaline high. And then when you're done, now the parasympathetic nervous system is kicking in, right? Also, with the sympathetic nervous system, might engage with release some cortisol. Remember, that's the stress hormone. And if your system's flooded with cortisol, then effectively no new learning can take place. And then the polyvagal nervous system is responsible, and this is the one that maybe not as familiar to you, but it's the one responsible for connecting us to others. I love this one. Now, if we think of collectivist cultural practices, in those communities, people have reinforced this natural tendency and deepened the brain's hardwiring for relationships. This nervous system encourages social bonding through the release of hormones such as oxytocin when we are in the presence of others. When we feel safe in the presence of others, our breath comes easily, our heartbeat is regulated, we don't sweat nervously, our thinking is clear, and we feel open, expansive, and in sync. As you can imagine, this is the nervous system we really want to engage when we are in the classroom together as a community. If we can feel and flood our system with oxytocin, that is our brain's stand down signal to the amygdala, right? It's like, I am safe here, I am in community with others, and I belong. And that is something that as educators, it is our responsibility to create that safe environment so students can feel that oxytocin, feel engaged with one another, and excited to be there in your class so they can learn. So I hope I've been able to kind of give you a reason to why understanding how the brain works is important to both educators and to students. We are learning partners together, regardless of what our title is. So my students teach me so much. I have learned so much from my students over the years and have, adjusted my teaching techniques to better serve their needs. Likewise, students, I hope that you feel that your professors are your learning partners as well, that you feel respected, and that you have something to contribute to the class. And so relationships exist at the intersection of mind-body, and they are the precursor to learning. I just wanted to really emphasize that with you. I think for so long in our educational system, it's been a very top-down approach, where the professor or the teacher stands in front of the classroom and they're the expert in their fields, and they're just there to transfer all the information from their head to all their students. And whoever can grab on the information, good for them, and they move on and whatnot, right? Like that's what it's always been. And I feel like it's never been this relationship, right? But if we have a relationship with our students, then we can engage in learning together. And this is all about building a learning community. Imagine if you're a student or if you're an educator, think about your students, kind of, invoke that empathy. If a student experiences a classroom that's inattentive or hostile, that body, now that we understand how the brain works, that body picks up that information through the autonomic nervous system and sends it up to the RAS and amygdala. It's firing, right? Cortisol is flooding through our body, adrenaline. That amygdala is sending out those stress signals that the body is not socially, emotionally, or intellectually safe. That shuts down learning. The brain at that moment in time doesn't produce enough oxytocin and begins to experience anxiety, which triggers the sympathetic nervous system. It's making one think that they're in danger because their brain doesn't experience a sense of community. So when your students are coming to you and they say, I have testing anxiety, and myself included, I suffered from that, where do you think that comes from? Well, that comes from a history of taking exams, a history of being graded and being judged solely on, one test, right? And therefore, that can be a trigger for students for any classes, no matter how welcoming you may be as an educator, right? If a student has experienced trauma in the classroom, they're going to bring that trauma with them. So it's important for us to recognize in that, if someone comes to you and says, oh, I have testing anxiety, it is not okay to just be like, oh yeah, everyone has testing anxiety, get over it, right? It's important to work with that student to help them to identify, where has this testing anxiety, when did it start, right? What are ways that we can together in this relationship between instructor and student help to reduce that testing anxiety? Or alternatively, coming up with some authentic assessments beyond just testing them that will engage in deeper learning and complex cognitive exercises so that students are learning but are not just experiencing this crazy anxiety because their whole grade is being determined by 2 or 3 tests. So when we look at the stress that some students experience in the classroom, and I want to kind of move towards, marginalized communities, and we're thinking about students who are experiencing stress because of their race, their class, their socioeconomic status, their language, their gender. We have to understand their safety threat detection system is already cued to be on the alert for social and psychological threats based on that past experience. We need to approach education through a trauma-informed lens, right? And so that's really important for us to understand. It's critical we understand then how to build positive social relationships that signal to the brain a sense of physical, psychological, and social safety so that learning is possible. So maybe when you first start teaching a class, having the students help you identify some community norms so that everyone respects one another and feels safe in the environment in the classroom, whether it's online or in person. Another way to engage students into the learning process and creating a safe space is having them help develop almost like a syllabus, if you will, of a contract. I call it contract grading, right? So basically having the students identify what types of assessments they would like to participate in order to earn their grade, right? So based on Zaretta Hammond's book, she's got some great culturally responsive brain rules. And when you understand these brain rules, it becomes easier to understand how the brain uses culture to interpret threats and opportunities. That's why I've been spending the past half hour talking to you about how the brain works and, certain scenarios that might trigger the brain and shut down learning. Now, with that lens and with that information in mind, we can design our lessons in such a way that meets the student's needs and minimizes anybody's amygdala from firing off and shutting down the learning process. Rule number 1. The brain seeks to minimize social threats and maximize opportunities to connect with others in community. The brain will not seek to connect with others if it perceives them to be threatening to its social or psychological well-being based on what they say and do. The amygdala stays on alert, trying to detect microaggressions. Now, this is something we have to consider as instructors. We have to educate ourselves to what types of microaggressions we may be giving to students. We also need to educate ourselves and become more aware if there are microaggressions taking place between peer to peer so that we can intervene. Likewise, for students, if you're witnessing a microaggression taking place, what can you say or do to stop that from happening further? And that could be a microaggression, once again, between a student and instructor. So if you have a complaint about an instructor who is giving you microaggressions, then that's something that I'd hope you'd be able to talk to maybe that instructor, or if not, a counselor on ways that you can educate that instructor about what they're doing and that it's hurting your learning and hurting you. So I just want to be clear what microaggressions are. They're subtle, everyday verbal and nonverbal slights, snubs, or insults, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to people of color based solely on their marginalized group membership. The brain needs to be part of a caring social community. So when we're talking about education, we're really talking about our classrooms. That is a community. That's an ecosystem in of itself. It wants to maximize its sense of well-being. It is crucial that marginalized students feel affirmed and included as valued members of that learning community. That's why I'm a huge advocate for getting student input in terms of learning norms or community norms, getting student input on assignments. How is this assignment working for you? How can I make it better? Meeting with them one-on-one. If they're struggling, reach out early on, say, hey, let me help you. It's okay. If this is, difficult for you, it was difficult for me, remembering how it was to be a student and invoking that empathy for them. So Rule number one, let's minimize the social threats and maximize opportunities to connect with others in community. Rule number two, positive relationships keep our safety threat detection system in check. So if we have positive relationships, remember our body then is invoking the polyvagal nervous system and releasing oxytocin. And having that oxytocin triggered helps the amygdala stay calm so the prefrontal cortex can focus on higher order thinking and learning. So if you're an educator, you can think of ways that you can create positive relationships within your classroom. So, and that is online too, like coming up with some activities to help students get engaged with one another, setting up study groups, right? Hosting study sessions outside of office hours, right? So that students can engage with one another. Maybe doing a social hour. Also for students, if you realize that you're feeling disconnected and isolated, maybe consider how ways that maybe you can reach out to other peers in your classroom through discussion boards, through, I know a lot of students like to use Discord, whatever it is that works for you to engage in community. There's great student clubs on campus if you're at Mission College. So make sure that, if you have the ability to engage in those communities, that's going to really give you a sense of purpose and fulfillment where you are in your college career and help you persist in the long run. Rule number three, remember that culture guides how we process information. Cultures with a strong oral tradition rely heavily on the brain's memory and social engagement systems to process new learning. Learning will be more effective if processed using the common cultural learning aids, like stories, music, and repetition. These elements help build neural pathways and activate myelination, right? That fatty substance. Something that was really interesting to me as I'm reading through Zaretta Hammond's book is that it caused me to reflect on my organic chemistry class that I teach. Now, organic chemistry, a lot of times, is you're teaching students how bonds are broken and how bonds are formed. I always joke that, we're always making the good kind of drugs or the legal drugs, not the Breaking Bad kind of situation. But, it can become a very dry class. Like, I know my professors would tell me, I had to memorize all these reactions and their names. And that's it. They just memorize. But memorization never has worked for me. I have to come up with a creative way to understand this challenging material. And so towards the end of organic chemistry, which is a full year course, I would have my students create music videos. So they had to write the lyrics, if they had an instrument, have an instrument in there, or use background music, dance, sing, whatever, to be creative to teach an organic chemistry concept. More often than not, they would choose these really lengthy mechanisms and make a rap to it, which was fun. Someone did a Frozen theme kind of organic chemistry and went through a ton of reactions. And it was so fun to engage with that part of their brain. And in fact, a lot of my students who were maybe quieter through the year and didn't, kind of engage with me as much, actually just flourished with this assignment. And so I think that's because I engaged with those cultural learning aids through that process. And in the end, those students did so well in my course. And so I encourage you faculty out there who are watching this to be creative. Even if you're a STEM instructor, for example, have your students do a music video, have them do an art project, right? These are other ways we can authentically assess our students and actually engage with their deeper learning and complex cognitive processes in their brains. In addition, students, even if your faculty don't have some sort of, creative assignment like this, do it yourself. Some of you probably already are doing this, make songs, write poetry, any way you can kind of engage older learning or other learning aids and techniques, the better that information will stick. and you'll create those neural pathways to stay for good. And something I want to recognize and acknowledge here, because of our society's history of segregation and unequal educational opportunities, many communities of color continue to use natural learning modalities in the home and community. So they use that oral tradition because they didn't have access to textbooks. They didn't have access to the most recent research that was being taught at white communities of privilege, right? And so that's something we should recognize as educators, and that's why it's crucial we tap into these cultural learning aids when designing our assignments and activities. So rule number 4, attention drives learning. Every brain's RAS is tuned to novelty, relevance, and emotion. But each person interprets these 3 elements through their particular cultural lens. And so, for example, like I said earlier, the way I learn and what, piques my interest and, I find relevance in may not be what my students appreciate, right? Because we all have different lived experiences and we all have different cultural lenses that impact our learning. Just wanted to really emphasize that learning isn't a passive event, but a dynamic action. It really requires for us to have focused attention, active engagement, and conscious processing by the learner. And our goal for all educations, I always tell students, yes, I'm here to teach you chemistry, and I love chemistry so much, but that's not really what my goal is for you to learn all this chemistry. I mean, that'd be great, but for the majority of my students, they're going on and they're going to become doctors and pharmacists and engineers and nurses and do all these amazing things. And so really my goal as an educator is to help my students become independent learners, so that if they go on a career trajectory and they decide to change their mind, that's okay, because they can pick up a new skill, a new technique. They already figured out how their brain works and what is conducive for a good learning environment. And so I always want my students to become independent learners. That's the hallmark of the independent learners, their ability to direct their attention towards their own learning. Rule number 5. All new information must be coupled with existing funds of knowledge in order to be learned. So that's when we need to tap into what the students already know, and they already have a great amount of wealth of knowledge that we can tap into. There are ways in assignments that you can get students to talk about, okay, what do you know here? What have you learned in your past course that we can apply here? So engaging with the older information. What we already know is organized, though, according to our cultural experiences and values and concepts. So that's something to remember. To make that learning stick, we have to determine what students already know and understand how they have organized it in their schema. And also, students, make sure you recognize that when you take a physics class, even though you may not be a physics major, that physics can be used in chemistry, and that, physics can be used in biology and all sorts of areas of life, right? Don't just learn the information for a class and dump it, right? Learn it, read through it, keep all your old notes, kind of review over them periodically, right? So that your brain doesn't prune out those dendrites and those neural pathways of all that information, because you don't want to have to relearn it again. So from there, we must construct culturally based connections or scaffolds between the existing schema and new content. So for example, when I teach chemistry, I'm always trying to tie it back in to what students have learned from the past. I'm also trying to tie it into real world applications in biology and engineering and physics and all that. But it's really important to tie it back into the older knowledge that they already have. And then rule number 6, the brain physically grows through challenge and stretch, expanding its ability to do more complex thinking and learning. So when we look at the educational experiences of many groups marginalized by race, language, and socioeconomics, they often get watered down curriculum that doesn't require higher ordered thinking. And so to help students become independent learners, the brain needs to be challenged and stretched beyond its comfort zone with cognitive routines and strategies. And so Zaretta Hammond really just empowers us with this statement. Culturally responsive teaching is about empowerment and interrupting teaching practices that keep certain students dependent learners. And so what we have to understand is that many marginalized communities through systemic racism in our educational system have not had the opportunities to become independent learners. They haven't had equal access to technology, to books, and therefore that's where this idea of, this concept of watered down curriculum is coming from. And so it's really important as educators that we interrupt, we abolish those teaching practices that keep those students as dependent learners. Because remember, our goal is for every student to become independent, an independent learner and autonomous. And just turning up the rigor of the instruction and increasing the complexity of the content will not stimulate brain growth. Instead, challenging and stretching come with learning the moves, the skills, and the virtues to do more strategic thinking and information processing. So it's not so much as here's a really hard problem, figure it out, but it's developing activities in such a way that help those students to engage with the information, to be strategic when solving those problems, and to process that information in whatever way that makes sense to them. So what are those implications for building intellective capacity? So it is important that we understand how the brain responds to threats, whether they're real or perceived. And that's something I want to emphasize here. As instructors, a student may come to you and say that they are scared of chemistry. Now, the last thing you want to do is say, oh, this class is easy, don't worry about it, and just trivialize those fears, because their brain is already seeing this as a real threat. It's important that we recognize that as a real threat and walk them through it to help minimize those fears and those anxieties, create that supportive community with them, and engage with them regularly. Let them know you're safe, you belong here, you can do this. Our goal is to help culturally and linguistically diverse students easily reach a state of relaxed alertness. So if your students have had experienced past traumas in education, it is important that as educators, you help them feel welcome and understand and recognize those past traumas, but hopefully create a space where they feel this time is different. Remember that we want to engage our students, right? They won't learn if they're not engaged. And that combination of excitement and anticipation is what we call engagement. Authentic engagement begins with remembering that we are wired to connect to one another. So if you're an educator watching this video, really always think about how can you authentically engage with your students. Remember why you're here. Why are you an educator? And with that purpose, how can you connect with your students and build a safe learning community? And as students, coming into a class that you may have fears and anxieties about, think of ways that maybe you can engage with your peers, engage with your professor. More often than not, professors, we want you to come to office hours. We want to hear from you. We want to see your face. We want to be in person when we can, be in person again, and just understand that, we care about you. We care about your overall well-being holistically. And that includes not just academics, but the emotional side, the social side, the mental health side. So I just wanted to really emphasize that this is ongoing work for all of us in terms of education. We have a lot of work to do. So I want to leave you with a reflection. First of all, thank you for listening to my presentation. And I once again want to thank Zaretta Hammond for writing such an incredible book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly suggest that you do. It's incredible and eye-opening. It has changed the way I look at how I teach. Even if you're a student, I wish I had read that book as a student. Like, it would have taken me a lot less time to figure out how my brain works and how to study effectively. But anyways, so here's a reflection. I want you to think back to one of your favorite classes. What was it about the environment, teaching style, activities, peer-to-peer interaction that helped your brain feel safe and engaged? How do principles of neuroscience that we just covered, very basic, influence your learning and or teaching? What brain rules guide the way you study for a course and create a lesson for a class? So looking back to those 6 brain rules that Zaretta Hammond has outlined and that I gave you a summary of, which ones are the most important to you? And then come up with an action plan. If you're a student, come up with an action plan on how to help your brain, right? And help you feel safe, help you feel like you're in community and that you belong. And then as educators, we need to be thinking about all 6 of these rules when designing our lessons and activities. And this is something I encourage us all to do. It's important that we have brave and courageous conversations. If you witness microaggressions taking place in the classroom, whether you're an instructor or a student, how do you plan to respond to that situation? And I think that's important to do that reflection now when you're in a safe space. You can write it out, you can role play with someone. If you're witnessing a microaggression, what would you say? What would you do? Right? So thank you all for listening. I hope you found this presentation useful and you learned some new things. And just continue your work of reading and learning about how our brains work. Thank you again.